Hello, everybody, and welcome to Safe Space, the official Safe in Our World podcast. For those who don't know, the main goal of Safe in Our World is to create and foster worldwide mental health awareness within the video games industry and beyond. My name is Rosie, and today I'm joined by Sarah and Robin Gray. Robin is a patron of Safe in Our World, as well as being the founder of Gayming Magazine, which is the world's only LGBTQ+ video game magazine. Welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I hope I did your introduction justice.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we spent time together at an esports festival recently, and I think I taught you well.
Yeah, I think I know your scripts word by word, just for the first 20 minutes or 20 minutes, 20 words.
20 minutes.
Oh my God, no, please don't.
Maybe for me, that's, yeah.
No, 20 seconds I could do an introduction, but that's about it. So, one of the first questions we wanted to ask you, basically, because I think, if I'm right in saying this, you joined Safe in Our World way before Sarah and I both did. And so we don't actually know how you initially got involved with the charity, because you did start out as an ambassador. That's right, isn't it?
I did, yes. So basically what happened was, as part of Gayming Magazine, we run the Safe in Our World. No, this is the Safe in Our World podcast. We run the gaming podcast. And we actually reached out as part of one of our episodes, I believe it was episode 15, and had Safe in Our World on as special guests. And we were joined by Gareth and Imogen, I believe. And at the time, it was just me being aware of their work, particularly because they were launching the Level Up Mental Health campaign, I believe. That was exactly the sort of thing that was happening. So they were relatively new to everything. And I think for me, it was kind of like I've always really mashed in with kind of like celebrating and supporting and promoting good mental health anyway. And so having them on as a guest on the podcast, I learned so much about the charity and their aims. And I think just afterwards, I just sort of said to them, sort of fairly anecdotally, like if you're looking for like ambassadors and stuff, I'd love to help out where I can. And I guess the rest is history.
Amazing. Hello, Robin.
Hello.
Hi. I haven't said hello yet. I've got a couple of questions actually. Can I ask you about the magazine? How did it start? What sparked the idea in the beginning? I think we've already said it's the only one in the world, and with 1 million readers, that's impressive. So I want to know about that. So that's my first question, and the second one is, in your opinion, is the video games industry friendly to LGBTQ identities? Now, they're two different questions, but really interested to know how it got started, and then to talk more about how this all fits in with the industry.
So I'll deal with the first question first, because the second question about LGBTQ identities in the video game industry is massively difficult and very complex.
Yeah, I just threw that in as a side question.
It's a good question, and we'll definitely come to it. It's just not as easy to answer, I suppose.
Yeah, of course.
It's pretty much the $1 million question.
Yeah.
So the first one, I think, how we started, like all good ideas, we started as a conversation down the pub. I was chatting to a friend, and that friend knew Dr. Joe Twist, who's the CEO of Yuki, who weirdly and quite coincidentally just walked past us at one point. And so my friend just grabbed her, sat her down. We had a very quick chat about video games, and and what we do as an LGBT media company. And she said, like, we don't have enough LGBTQ content or coverage of video games. And that just put a little seed in my brain. We already ran 2 successful LGBT magazines anyway. So I thought, okay, great, we can just put some video game content into those existing magazines. One particularly has a sort of nerdy, geeky bent anyway. So I kind of left it at that, and we carried on, had dinner. Then basically on the train on the way home, I suddenly thought, well, okay, so who else is doing this? Like, there must be somebody. There must be somebody in the media space that is doing LGBT gaming, because why wouldn't they? And kind of on the train home, I suddenly realized that there wasn't anybody doing it. And I think from that moment onwards, literally for like whatever the hour or so journey from London to Birmingham is, like all good things, again, scribbled on the back of a napkin practically, I sort of mapped out Gayming Magazine. and the concept of it. So that was in February of 2019. I had a call the next day with Jo, and she put me on to somebody else to talk to as well. We then secured a spot at London Games Festival that year in April to kind of do a soft launch to assembled kind of small press. And so that was with so that was at Yuki's headquarters, sorry, and that went really well. So that was in April, and then we launched on the 1st of June. And that was kind of like the whole sort of, we kind of birthed the idea in February, and then by June we were up and running, because of the sort of the background that we have, because of the fact we run other LGBT magazines anyway. The kind of the idea of getting something off the ground, starting something new, was never a big deal. It was just understanding exactly what you can and can't do in the video game world. Fast forward a little bit, then I'm not necessarily the world's biggest video gamer. Shock horror for this kind of podcast, and I apologize in advance. But
you're in good company, don't worry.
Don't give all the secrets away. The truth is, I am a gamer. I describe myself as a gamer, but I know what I like and I like what I play. So for me, the notion of being able to sort of understand perhaps all facets and all depths, and I think as well, some of the sort of what we'd maybe call the queer classics, like the JRPGs, the Final Fantasies, the Dragon Ages, those sort of things, like that has never been in my wheelhouse. So I kind of knew from the get-go that we'd have to launch with me as a sort of as the editor, but I needed backup pretty quickly. But I just had to get over those first couple of months to kind of prove our worth and then start earning some money, which we started to do with advertising. And then we basically then pulled in the wonderful Amy Hart, who had written a couple of early pieces for us as a freelancer. And then we basically launched into having her as our sort of part-time deputy editor. Fast forward 2 years, she's just taken on the full-time editorship, starting 1st of August, I think, of this year, 2021. So it's been a wild couple of years, but absolutely, this is where we've ended up with, as you rightly say, Sarah, we reach now over 1 million people a month, which is
That's
crazy.
amazing. That is amazing.
It genuinely is crazy, and it's growing. Like every month, it's still growing. So I think it just shows the value of and the power of video games to unite communities and to
Yeah.
bring together that whole
Yeah.
thing. And this kind of course, alongside all of that, we had, as I mentioned earlier, the podcast. Our podcast launched, I think that was November 2019, and then we kind of rode that wave on and off for a year as an audio podcast. Then we relaunched, I think it was November last year, as a live podcast on Twitch. That's just ended at the end of August because we all needed a break. But we're picking it up again with a Christmas special this year in December, and then bringing it back full time early next year in 2022. And then, of course, the other big thing we did is the Gaming Awards, which is again the world's first LGBTQ video game awards. There's a brilliant quote, and I say brilliant because I said it, but I mean, I didn't really mean to say it, but I kind of said it accidentally, but now I'm laying full claim to it. In an interview that was published yesterday, I think, with Overclockers on their blog, where I said something like, a lot of people in the mainstream kind of see these awards and see it as like, oh, we just give it to all the gay games. And it's like, it's not actually that simple. We don't just sit there and go, that game's gay, let's give it an award. It actually, a lot of our awards are actually celebrating LGBTQ people and their contribution to games making, or even streaming, or those sort of things. I think half of the awards in the last year's iteration were celebrating people rather than games themselves. And I think that's going to be the same for this year's awards. We've got new categories and stuff, and that's being revealed in a couple of weeks' time.
I was just going to say, I think it's super important to be able to actually celebrate people and the people behind games as well, because it's often forgotten and it becomes more of a focus on the consumer side of games, which is fine, but it's a whole industry with thousands of workers behind it.
Totally, absolutely. And I think that's the point. And I think that the genesis of all of this for me was the UK's diversity census that came out in February of 2020, literally like weeks before the pandemic started. And the survey said that there was 21% of the UK video games industry identified as LGBTQ, which is crazy and huge, because the sort of the going average sort of estimate is between 4 to 8% of the population. So to say 21%, that's 1 in 5 of the people that answered. There are some questions about the survey. There were some questions about sample sizes and that sort of thing, but it was carried out by a very, very experienced person at Sheffield University. So I fully stand by a lot of the results that they sort of pumped out. And so that was kind of genesis. It kind of validated a lot of what we set out to do with gaming from the get-go, because gaming as a magazine has never just been about the games. It's always been about the people as well. We feature a lot of spotlight interviews on creators. We feature a lot of interviews on sort of voice. They need celebrating, and they're not being celebrated, because at the moment you kind of get, with a lot of award shows, a lot of the games award shows, you kind of get the diversity category, the sort of the soft and fluffy special awards kind of category. And I think that's kind of, it's disingenuous to kind of like lump everything together into this almost kind of special thing that you just like pat the diverse people on the head and pack them off back into the box for next year. And I think for me, it's kind of having that full award show that celebrates every facet of games making and the games industry, but with a queer twist, for me is something that I think is really exciting. And that kind of then propelled us forward into that idea. The other thing, to sort of pivot into mental health a little bit, the other thing that emerged from that survey is that LGBTQ video games workers have an inordinately higher amount of mental health, stress, anxiety issues than standard games workers, who already have quite high mental health, stress, and anxiety issues. And a lot of it related to the trans community as well in video game world. So I think for me, it's kind of, the survey did a good job of showing there's a lot of queer people in the industry, but it also said there's a lot of queer people that need support in the industry. Hence when obviously Safe in Our World starts to come back in again.
It just highlights the need for people not only to be celebrated, because I think from all of the award shows that I've seen, it's always the usual suspects and the same games and the same companies, which is kind of sad, because there's so much out there and there's so many people out there who are hidden in the shadows, and adding that sense of belonging to the industry is only going to be able to support the employees better, but also make them feel like it's an industry that they do belong in and they can thrive in, rather than having to, I don't know, like I guess there's just a huge need for this, and the fact that you're the only one in the world doing an LGBTQ plus magazine is bizarre to me, because if there's 1 million readers, so many people resonate with your message.
Yeah, you definitely saw a gap and you filled it brilliantly. Yeah, I literally can't believe it's the only one, but I'm so happy that you're leading the way with this, because there is such a need, and those statistics just shout it so loudly. Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. So, if that leads on to the next question that I alluded to, Robin, is the video games industry friendly to LGBTQ identities, or is there more we can do?
I think representing LGBTQ identities in the video game industry, obviously, as I joked earlier, is the $1 million question. And I think that's what we've touched on, obviously, is the fact that there are 21% of the industry are LGBTQ. So there are people there from the working side that have to be represented. And I think the industry does a passable job, to be frank, of working with them. I mean, there are challenges in the industry from an employment side of things, but I think that we are starting to see good initiatives start to come up. The larger companies with their staff representation groups are starting to come through really strongly. We've featured and interviewed quite a few of them on gaming. And I think as well, I think there's been some lessons from the pandemic that people can take forwards, particularly anecdotally around trans people who have said to me that one of the best things, if you can say there's a best thing about a global pandemic, but one of the best things for them is that the actual idea of working from home, that the notion that they can be at home and they can be in a safe space of their own making where they can be authentically themselves and true to themselves is really important, that they're not having to go into an office to exist in a space that potentially is a bit toxic for them or just uncomfortable for them if perhaps they're mid-transition perhaps, or they're wanting to explore their identity a bit more, or the way they present themselves. So I think there have been kind of good things that have grown out of the pandemic, but I think it's, if we can carry some of those lessons forwards, it'd be a good thing for the industry. In terms of then representing the LGBT people in games, obviously the indie game scene is where it's at the moment, and it still is the best way of representing LGBT people and LGBT experiences, because they can tell authentic stories. Mentioning obviously the gaming awards earlier, we actually have indie game categories and authentic representation categories in the awards to try to celebrate and help show off these wonderful games that people maybe never have heard of. But we're starting to see it come through into the mainstream. I mean, the sort of, I think the argument previously about the fact that diverse games don't sell has been proven wrong significantly, because obviously with The Last of Us 2 being released last year, I think that still is the Sony's PlayStation's best selling first party game, and that obviously is fronted by a fabulously queer woman and features other representations of LGBT people. And we're starting to see more and more AAAs come out with authentic content, authentically queer content, whether it's Borderlands, whether it's The Outer Worlds, even as far as Forza 5 that's out, I think it's next week after end of the month. They, as a racing game, which people would immediately assume would have no business even worrying about LGBT stuff, as in the character creation screen of Forza, you can choose pronouns. That's amazing. That's huge.
I had no idea about that. I love that.
Absolutely, and it's that kind of normalization, I think, is key, particularly in games where, and I think a lot of people have said in the past when I've had conversations with them, it's like, well, not every game can have queer content. It's like, that's absolutely true. It's not an expectation that every single game has queer content, but even sports games, driving games, you can just, as part of the character creation, just put pronoun choices in. Don't don't force people into kind of like choosing, is your character male or female? Like, it doesn't matter. Just simple little things like that can make a huge difference, and it actually normalizes the whole thing for people who don't identify, as LGBTQ. It's just seeing these kind of behaviors and seeing these kind of choices in the world is a good way of getting people used to that. So I think it's tricky. That this is why I'm sort of like stumbling a little bit, I suppose, is the fact that the big question of how the video game industry treats LGBTQ people, or how it deals with their identities, is there's good and there's bad.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's the industry that's the worst. Like, I think it's, of course, it's the fans, it's the gamers with a Z, that's where the issues lie. But I mean, that's not unique to LGBTQ people. They don't particularly care for people of color or women either. So I think all diversity as a whole has a problem there. But it's the fan base that's toxic. I don't particularly think it's the industry. I think the industry is actually changing for the better. They know and they can see that the world changes, and I think they have to keep up with that. I mean, video games are notoriously behind they're behind the eight ball a little bit in terms of like TV and film have been through this already. But video games particularly are the ones that maybe are a little bit behind, but they're catching up fast. And I think the faster that the in-game content changes, I think the faster that the industry changes. And I've always said that if you are a diverse company, you will make diverse games. So I think increasing the industry's efforts to increase recruitment from underrepresented communities And I think the industry's efforts to then accommodate them while needing further work, we are seeing good progress being made, I feel.
Yeah, it's a journey, isn't it? But it sounds like we're making some progress, and everything that we do here at Safe, can help that, just to be as inclusive as possible. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different groups as well that's doing fantastic work. Like obviously Gaming Magazine, but then also like Out Making Games. For those who don't know, are here to basically connect and empower the community, the LGBTQ plus community that works in the industry itself. There's Yuki's Raise the Game pledge, which is all about making and inspiring change within the industry to be more inclusive. There's an amazing, I found when I was doing some research earlier on in the year, there's this amazing database that is called Represent Me. And I don't know if you've heard of it, Robin, but there's it's massive. There's thousands and thousands of games on there, and you can basically search in the keywords about what you're trying to find with so many different options. So if you're looking for a game with a protagonist that's gay, or like um, there's a secondary or an NPC that is lesbian, for example, you can search that and find games that specifically fit that description, which I think is really cool.
that is cool.
Yeah, and then there's also a something else called peer-to-peer live, which is like an opt-in discoverability tool for streamers that are marginalized and viewers to find each other through identity tagging, which again is like a really nice way to be empowered by your identity and not feel like you have to hide. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of different positive forces within the industry, and though there are challenges, it is changing, and I agree that there is hope for a more positive outlook on it. There's lots of different organizations, as I've mentioned, that are really embedding safe spaces within the industry, and they're looking specifically to support LGBTQ plus communities. And I know that we've briefly touched on it already, and we've talked about it a little bit at this esports festival. But there's the statistics, especially within the UK census, are quite sobering to hear. And I know, Sarah, you've got a couple of points that we talked about previously about the census as well. That it's for people who don't know, can I don't know where I'm going with this.
Neither do I.
Neither do I. Yeah. Okay. So I guess the main statistic that hit home for me was that 55% of the trans community within the games industry experienced anxiety or depression, which is triple the national average, which is both surprising and not, but very sad all the same. And I guess I don't know whether there's a specific question, but I just thought it would be good to throw that in there so that people understand the impact that they might not realize on marginalized communities within the games industry.
I think the trans community, particularly, is always going to be, sadly, struggling with mental health. And I think that's something that we have to address as an industry, but I don't think it's necessarily specifically industry related. We have to look, we can only look at every day when you turn on Twitter or you turn on the news, and there's the latest attack on a trans person, whether that's sadly a physical attack or whether it's a press-driven right-wing attack, because the trans community appear to have found themselves as the right wing's whipping people and topic of the month if they ever need to lean on how terrible the community is changing. So I think it's, again, not as somebody that identifies as trans, but with plenty of people who around me who identify as trans or non-binary, that the exhaustion felt by the trans community is on a daily basis just for existing is terrible. And then you add to that going into a workplace that is not built to support them. And again, this isn't necessarily, I don't think any industry person or any industry company sets out to specifically persecute their trans employees. Like that's not happening. I just think they're not thinking about it, because, and it can be simple things. Just have gender neutral toilets. Just have a load of gender neutral toilets that are big cubicles that have the sinks in, and it's dead easy. You just go in, you do what you need to do, and you walk back out again. And that's simple. I don't understand how tricky that can be. And I think then some of the kind of like the legacy kind of bro culture is still existent in the industry. That obviously has to be snuffed out. And I think that, as I said, the issues around working from home during a transition or while they're kind of experiencing some dysphoria or something. Like, I mean, we as a company ourselves, and as an LGBT media company, we have mental health days. You can literally call me on the morning and say, I've got to work from home, or I need a day off. It's just a bad mental health day. Fine. Because I think the issue here is that mental health and physical health have to be treated as one. It should just be called health. Are you healthy? That's either mental or physical. And I think that for me, it's kind of, if you tie those two things together, then I think trans people, LGBTQ people, anybody really who works in the games industry can be better supported, because you're thinking in the round. If somebody was in an accident and had a debilitating kind of leg injury, you wouldn't be sort of going, oh, we'll just come to the office and favor the other leg. You'd be saying, no, work from home. We'll ship all your stuff home. If somebody calls in and goes, I'm in the middle of a sort of mental health crisis, it should, the default should be just work from home, just take time off, just look after yourself. Not, are they putting it on? Are they really sort of chancing their arm? Are they taking the mick? Are they? And it's just like the levels of support for mental health health emergencies versus physical health emergencies is staggeringly different. And I think that there's so much that could be done, and it's not rocket science. They're not saying that the entire organization has to suddenly start fully embracing like all LGBTQ practices and everything else. Like, it just needs to be just levels of understanding. Using pronouns, put pronouns in your signature. Simple little things like that, just to show that all people are welcome, that people who are however they identify are welcome and supported at work. And it's ludicrously, I find it ludicrously simple to sort of execute these things. But I think trying to change massive organizations is like trying to turn a ship around. But I will give a sort of shout outs. We've come across a lot of companies that through their ERG groups, through their employee resource groups and support groups and stuff, they are making positive changes. So I think we are starting to see these things happen, but I think there's, tying it back to that sort of initial question of the trans community are getting it tough in the industry, well, the trans community are getting it tough in life in general. I think the fact that the industry then is not supporting them is just yet another kind of assault on that practice. But I think the trans community, sadly, are not having a great time, full stop, at the moment.
Do you think that will change as we move forward? I mean, around some of the conversations we've had around mental health, working with students, we're trying to empower the students that we work with to, when they go into the industry and into a company, they have a level of expectation that if they're suffering with bipolar, with anxiety, whatever, that there'll be something in place to support them and look after them. So we have this hope. I think there's a statistic, 75% of the workforce will be millennials by 2025. Now, does that follow through with LGBTQ? You know, will we become more educated in the, you know, if people at a student level can have that expectation, this is who I am, and expect when they come into the industry that they will be treated fairly? I'm just wondering if there's more we can do at that early level to say, you know, to really get that point across. And I think universities are an example where I still think there's issues where, you know, people from the LGBT community are still hiding away. They're not being true to themselves. They're not being honest because they don't feel they're able to. And I just feel there's a lot more can be done at that point to allow people to be themselves and have an expectation that when they go into the workplace that they will be supported.
I agree completely, and I think there's kind of two issues there. I think there's one of readying people at an earlier age, and I think you're absolutely right. I think it's, and this comes back, I think, to some of the practices that happen in universities around kind of, I was introduced to the notion of game jams a long time ago, and I don't find them particularly healthy. The notion of competitive nature of kind of like you have to stay up till God knows what time in the morning cramming stuff in, and isn't it fun that we're spending all weekend designing a video game? It's like, no, this is the industry training you for crunch. This is the industry training you to accept crunch. Stop doing that. If you're going to do a game jam, at least stretch it over 2 weeks or something. But that's one of my little pet peeves. But I think the other thing as well, from an LGBT point of view, is that people should be taught and accepted. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there needs to be a level of acceptance and expectation and support in university level to show this is what the industry can be. This is an idealized version of this is what a perfect studio should do for you. And then people should be voting. And I know that people are. I know some people that have either not joined a company because they know that company has a terrible reputation for looking after its LGBT staff, or they've left. And I think that as people get more empowered, and I think as expectations change and people know that the industry can be better, and the evidence and the interviews start to come out to show that the industry is doing, certain parts of the industry, certain companies are doing better than others, I think people voting with their feet and going to companies that they know are LGBTQ friendly, that demonstrate good LGBTQ and mental health practices, I think that's going to force change. I think that people that, or industries or companies that in the industry say that actually that maybe aren't being quick to put some of these things in place, maybe they're not going to start recruiting as many members of staff. Maybe their vacancies are going to sit empty a bit longer. And I think that in itself, I think that notion of people voting with their feet or people not going to certain companies, I think that's really important. And I think that actually might look after itself. And I think, going back to what you said about universities, I think if people have come through universities knowing and being taught that this is the base level of expectation that you should have for a job, actually maybe that in itself is kind of a lesson to people to say, this is what you're worth, this is what you should accept. Never go to a job that hasn't told you how much salary is being paid. All these sort of things. I think honestly, the university could do a lot of work to help prepare students to find ethical jobs. And I think as part of that then will force the industry to sort of take a hard look at, oh God, they're going into a certain direction because they don't know that we're LGBTQ friendly or we have good mental health practices. Why? Because you don't put it on the damn website. Like we started to do loads of interviews when we started gaming, and the first one we spoke to was Mediatonic, who are fabulous. I will say this up front, who are fabulous, and they had almost since their inception they had an LGBT group. And when I spoke to them initially back in 2019, we did an interview with them about the work that their Pride group has done, their latest fundraising for mermaids, I believe it was. And at the time, when I spoke to them, they were like, "Oh," and I said, "How long have you been running this for?" And it's like, "About 5 years." And it's like, "Well, why haven't you spoken about this to anyone before?" And it's like, "Well, we didn't want to." They thought they were being, they thought they were showing off. They thought they were being opportunistic or sort of banging a queer drum that wasn't theirs to bang, in a sense. And I sort of said, no, you need to bang this drum and bang it loud, because how do queer people know that you're a good employer to go and work for? And they were like, oh yeah. And so it's kind of like, you need to talk about these things. If you do fundraising, if you have an ERG group, if you do Pride events, put it on your Twitter, talk about it, be proud of it. Because when I know for a fact, I've got a friend that has just graduated from university in video game art design. He specifically goes onto the company's websites that have vacancies, and if there's no evidence or their Twitter or whatever else, if there's no evidence of them doing anything pro LGBTQ, at least in the Pride months, let alone all year round, he doesn't apply for it because he wants to go somewhere that he knows is securely going to support him. And I think the same for mental health as well. I'd love to start to see games companies actually talk about how they have all the usual sort of packages and whatever else. Oh, we use flexible working. We have 10 ball ponds. We have 12 slides and a swing and stuff. And it's like, well, how about actually having like a good mental health strategy or something?
But and actually, they should advertise.
Let's talk about that bit rather than the fact that your new London office has got all these fantastic things that are just pointless because all the bros hang out there and drink beer. Like, just put it on the website that you have good mental health first aiders perhaps or whatever. And it's just like,
Yeah.
I think that's what people should be looking at.
Yeah, and companies should be worthy of attracting the new talent coming through,
Correct,
and it
exactly,
to flip
exactly.
it over, rather than you
Yeah,
necessarily in
rather
an
than the
interview.
desperation to work in the
Yeah,
industry. Yeah,
exactly. "Please
yeah,
take me. This is my dream
yeah,
job." Would be like,
yeah,
"What can you offer me? I've got
exactly.
all
Yeah,
this talent.
yeah.
How can you support me?" And that flip will be a massive.
It'd be
Yeah,
huge, and I love the idea of people sitting. I love the idea of people having the confidence, and I think that's a key word. Is they need to be taught
yeah,
confidence.
yeah,
But I love the idea of people with confidence sitting in an interview, sitting in a room like I'm sat in at the moment with two other people. They're not sat here. I mean, in the interview, they're sat with two other people, and saying like, "That's all great. Now I identify as bi or queer or pan or whatever. How does your organisation support its LGBTQ
yeah,
workforce?" There's
yeah.
always that wonderful space at the end of an interview where you should ask questions of the interviewers.
Yes.
Ask some questions. Say to them like, how what policies around mental health do you have? What
Yeah,
policies around LGBTQ
yeah,
workers or diverse workforces do you have? It'll make them think, and I think and I think worthiness is important. I think saying to them like, there's a really old catchphrase in job hunting, which is you should interview them as much as they should interview you. So
yeah.
hold them to account. Ask those questions.
Mhm. Yeah,
I would also like love to see, like we've already talked about this a little bit, but like healthy competition with companies in the industry as well, but not only for well-being and for LGBTQ plus resources and support, but just inclusivity as a whole, instead of just
Mm.
kind of chucking this like nondescript policy and then saying, you know what, that's sorted, we've fixed it, we're all good. Like actually following through on that and putting things in place rather than just. I think a lot of companies are all talk to say that they're inclusive,
yeah,
but they actually have nothing to support that they are.
Oh, absolutely. I think yeah, it's just as easy to put a piece of paper on a file in the HR sort of going, well,
mm,
there's our diversity policy. Well done, everyone. And it's like, but actually, how are you carrying that out? What are you actually doing?
yeah. It's like a lot of companies during lockdown would send their staff a fruit basket or some seeds. It's a nice idea, but it's not really tackling the issues that those members of staff
Mm.
might be suffering. So it's just a bit of a bigger picture, isn't it? Just think it through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's how the industry can change positively is actually about making these changes to the things that people actually want in their careers. Um, I think the notion of an office space that's has like to sort of continue flogging the metaphor, sort of all these different ball ponds and swings and slides and hammocks and whatever else. It's like that's great, but let's start with the basics. Like,
Yeah,
do you have a mental health first aider? Do you
yeah,
have a quiet sort of breakout space that people that are having a crisis can just go and sit in and just chill and decompress? Do you have strategies to cope with crunch? Do you know what I mean? Like
yeah, yeah,
they're the real things
yeah.
that
Stay away from
employers,
the big gimmicks.
yeah,
And
that
actually provide excuse me, actually provide what will be helpful to
yeah,
the teams and the talents that are working
and
hard.
healthy. And I think like everyone's quick to sort of have like when you move into new offices or you start with a new company, you're told where the first aid kits are. You're told where the accident book is. You're told where, and again, it comes back to
Mm,
physical health. Physical health is fully catered for in an
mm,
office space, but mental health still is not. And
yeah,
I think that the notion that these days, and it's obviously not just an issue for the video games industry. I think it's an industry. I think it's a countrywide thing, and like we need to integrate mental health with physical health.
mm,
We
mm,
we shouldn't have these kind of barriers between. Like if I fell over, I could pick up I could pick up a phone, get an ambulance, take me to hospital, get my leg plastered up, job done. But if I'm having a mental health crisis, who do I call? And
mm.
then, of course, the people that I call, if it's outside of 9 to 5, then you have to call the police, which is never ends
Yeah,
well for a mental health crisis.
no,
And I think it's like having these things like this. We've gone way off track from video games mind at this point, but I think having these kind of like macro sort of things solved on the country level is something that can be replicated on a much smaller level. Going back to video games in the video game industry is making sure that the companies at least have as much attention paid
yeah.
to the
It's
mental health as
encouraging
to
that
the physical health.
equality between the two, isn't it? That they're
Absolutely,
exactly the
absolutely.
same.
Yeah.
It costs nothing to have like even a little sheet with a bunch of good resources and numbers on when you
Yep.
first walk in the door, even if it's
Mm,
on the wall, if it's in a welcome pack, like
mm.
on a online space, like it costs nothing to be able to signpost people that way, and that's the bare minimum.
One of my old companies that I used to work for before I actually worked in the video game industry, they actually had one of these health plan things that you paid a little bit into that got discounted kind of like healthcare and whatever else for physical health. But they actually had
Oh,
a 24/7 number that was available for counselling. And I thought that was brilliant, even like 10 years ago, for someone to be able to pick the phone up
Yeah.
and have a counsellor on tap. I mean, that is a simple thing that can easily be kind of replicated around
Yeah.
most companies.
We, we always promote, EAPs,
Mm,
um, because, just to have that they're really quite cheap to have within
yeah,
within a company. It's literally a few quid per employee a year. Um, so, employee assistant programs, sorry, for those who don't know what an EAP is, it really is such an easy way. And they often cover a spouse or, other members of the family. So, it's a really quick, easy way. And those counsellors will talk about anything. They're fully trained counsellors. So, yeah,
mm,
that's a really good point that we encourage.
absolutely.
Mm.
As you say, doesn't cost much, but it just provides that extra level, that extra layer of support. And I think having some mental health first aiders on site, like mental health first aid training, is not
Yes.
is not particularly
No,
expensive and not
no.
particularly kind of rocket science to implement either. So,
Yeah, absolutely, and we encourage even mental health champions.
mm,
So some people that might be suffering, they don't wanna go to their line manager. They're fearful that it might reflect badly on, so you have champions that you can talk to privately, that are just you can just book an appointment with them and, all of that stays in the room, and that just gives a bit of confidence that you've got someone to talk to.
yeah,
There should be no comeback on your job, but some people have that fear still. But that's part of the organisation's job as well, to dispel that fear, and that you are free to talk about anything you're suffering with. Like we've said a million times, you come in with a bad back, you tell everybody. You come in and say that you've been up all night with severe anxiety. No one says that. So it
yeah,
is just that start that conversation. But that does have to come from the top down in a company. That's one of the important things is the higher management need to be open
yeah.
about their views. Any lived experience that they've got is brilliant because it just gives that confidence for other people to say, "Yeah, do you know what? I can talk about that. I'm suffering from this." And it makes the workplace, it's so different if you've got that level of openness.
That goes twofold for sort of going back full circle back to LGBTQ themes as well. Like bottom up only gets you so far, and it's from the sort of being generated from the workers. From the top down is where it's at, and
Yeah.
there needs to be executive level champions, yes, but also representation. With the last bastion, I think of is fascinating going back to the Yuki survey. The 21%. If you then extrapolate that by levels of seniority, it really starts to go small when it gets up to the top levels of companies. Still, like LGBTQ representation is poor, POC representation is poor, women's representation is poor, the further up the chain you go. And I think that's something that you mentioned earlier about how the sort of millennials are starting to phase into companies. We are starting to see new companies created with a diverse board from the get-go, but we're also starting to see companies where the board is changing as well. And I think that whether it's representation, whether it's championing LGBT rights, whether it's mental health, it has to start on the board and come down. And I think that's where we are in a process of sort of dealing with it. But I think it's something that it can only be affected at that level. There's only so much like individual employees can sort of do and shout about.
Yeah, yeah.
The resource groups that are run by employees, they're great, but where's that glass ceiling of, well, we need these changes making, and that's where you start to get that sort of break issue. Is, oh well, it's got to the boss has to sign this off, or the head of HR
Mhm.
has to sign this off, and that's where the sort of like penny pinching or the sort of like the sucking through teeth starts to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if you're in a senior position where you are in a privileged place and you're not marginalized and you're not discriminated against because of your identity, there are really simple things that you can do to be able to even get on the same page. Like education is massive, and not expecting other people to educate you is huge. Just seeing like what self-reflecting on what the issues might be that aren't from your own point of view is massive. And just having those conversations with people who are able to make change happen is the start of something massive for people who might not be able to influence change from the bottom as well. So yeah, being aware of your privilege within senior positions as well is big for me.
Mm-hmm.
I guess moving slightly back to games specifically, I guess, Robin, you mentioned at the start that you didn't really feel as though you connected with the more popular or the more like RPG games that came out, or that are traditionally LGBTQ plus inclusive. So what do you think? Do you connect with any other games specifically? Would you suggest any games to people who identifies as LGBTQ plus, or someone who wants to learn more about being in their shoes? Would you have any recommendations game wise for people on both ends of the spectrum?
The one game that I always lean on as an example of this is Tell Me Why, which was the first major game with a trans protagonist. And what I absolutely adore about it, the sort of the saying goes that never judge somebody until you've walked a mile in their shoes. Well, the good thing about video games is you literally can walk a mile in someone's shoes. And I think this game is a perfect example of that because you embody the character of Tyler, who is a trans man, and the whole notion of the story is very complicated. But inherently, you're going back to your village in Alaska that you were born in, but you were born as the opposite gender at that point. And so for me, it's kind of it's an interesting concept because it's the first time that I think I played a game like that because again, as you say, I don't particularly not normally connecting with that kind of game, but I thought, you know what, I'm going to play it, and I played it, and genuinely, it was like living through a movie, and I think I was so affected by the game, and I was so affected by the relationships and the way that you were treated as Tyler, you were treated by the townsfolk. Now, the developers were very careful. They worked with GLAAD. They worked with some of the actual trans employees. August, who voices Tyler, is a trans man, and he had quite a lot to say about the character's development and experiences as well, which is fantastic. They're careful over the fact that they didn't want to make it like a trans bashing game. So they kind of always wanted to be on the positive side of things. So, but they also didn't want it to be all fully rosy and happy and whatever else. And so I think it was there were moments in the game where there were kind of like the supporting characters who hadn't met Tyler as a man were very kind of like they were stumbling over their words. They were sort of like they didn't know what to say. It just made it awkward. And I think that even just experiencing that little bit of awkwardness, let alone any of the kind of like the real negative stuff that can happen, was a real eye opener. And like I say, as somebody that doesn't identify as trans, for those beautiful hours, I kind of felt like it's the closest I got. And I was really appreciative of that because as somebody I think that kind of prides myself on being able to empathize with all members of the LGBT community, even I was able to sort of learn some extra stuff from that. Even I learned some of the relationships dynamics and that sort of stuff. And I just found it beautiful and really, really interesting. So that's kind of like the sort of the go-to game that I always sort of push at. But the other games that I always like to sort of talk about as well are the ones where the representation in it is authentic, or the authentic representation is a real big thing for me. And I think that what I mean by that is that it's a bit like the Forza. It's a bit like Forza and the pronouns. It's something that just happens, and there's no need to talk about it. There's no need to make a big deal out of it. But the one I always lean on is Borderlands. I'm a huge Borderlands fan, and this whole series is littered with amazingly positive queer characters, but in a blink and you'll miss it kind of way. Some are a bit more obvious than others, but a lot of them, they even just sit there and talk anecdotally about that they mention their ex-boyfriend, and they'll never say it again. But for that glimmering moment, if you clock it, it's like, oh, okay, he had an ex-boyfriend. And so I think that it's those kind of moments of authenticity where there aren't sort of like rainbow confetti cannons going off in the background. And that sort of stuff. It's just a normalized thing. The Outer Worlds actually did a really good job with Pavati, who identified as asexual, and it's one of the first major representations of asexuality in a game. And again, did it beautifully because it was just a few token kind of words and gestures and sentences that expressed the entire kind of experience almost, but in a beautifully authentic kind of way. Again, it wasn't labored, it wasn't like a huge plot point. It was just a person being them. And I think that is the way forward, I think, with a lot of this, is like having NPCs or playable characters that are just part of the LGBT community and normalizing saying they had a boyfriend, normalizing they saying they have a husband and this sort of stuff. And I think that's kind of like the way forward. And so for me, like, yeah, if you want like the full experience, you want to learn something, go and play Tell Me Why. If you just want to shoot some people, but equally have a wonderfully diverse time doing it, play Borderlands.
Amazing. I love that. I love the contrast of both
Yeah.
games because they're so vastly different. But I really like. I'm a Borderlands fan as well, and it is nice to just see it's so nonchalant in the way that they do it, and I think that's brilliant as well.
Absolutely, and it also normalizes it for straight people as well. And this is the kind of like the education part of it, is that it's all well and good having Tell Me Why, and I'm sure that they did a fantastic job, multi-award winning game. And you sort of have to put yourself in a straight person's shoes, which is a bit uncomfortable. But it's you sort of sit there and you go, would somebody who's straight go and choose to pick up that game, knowing full well what it's all about and the fact that it is just a full kind of lesson almost in a trans experience? Probably not, if we're being brutally honest. So they kind of knew where their bread was buttered anyway. But I think that the real lessons come through games that are more appealing to a kind of mainstream audience, that just dribble diversity into it for no reason other than just having good diversity in their games. And I also want, my sort of big desire would be having a bit like sort of Tell Me What, The Last of Us Part 2 and The Last of Us Part 1 as well, that is just a good game but has a queer character as the lead character. I would love more of those games to come out that actually have some romance built into it, like a dating mechanic that you can't avoid, that is with a sort of a queer relationship, because forcing people to just accept the fact that their lead character is in a homosexual relationship or is in a bisexual sort of triad or something is that's normality. That's the way it should be. Like the constant kind of pandering to this is the lead character, oh, and they're straight, is kind of like, it's getting a bit passé now.
Yeah,
And
you don't have to create a diverse game. You don't have to make it solely about LGBTQ plus. Like you can totally just include characters within a game.
Absolutely, but also I think occasionally having like romance into a game that is a queer romance that is unavoidable is also possibly a cheeky way of being a good way of sort of helping with some of that education as well. Like there are plenty of games out there that have romance mechanics that let you optionally date people of opposite sex or people of same sex, even like Assassin's Creed, for example. But that's fine. But that means that people can avoid the LGBT relationships, and that's okay. But why can't they just be a lesbian? Why can't they just be gay? Why can't they just be bi? And I think that's kind of, for me, that I would see that as kind of like the next big step, is like if the new Mass Effect came out and there was just you were playing as a character who was gay, full stop, end of story, no debate, no choices, no nothing. And not,
There's enough games at the moment that are just filled with straight characters that no
yeah,
one has any
exactly.
problem with. So
That's it.
why can't it be different?
And again, it doesn't have to have like massive amounts of romance. And I don't want to sort of make the mainstream people sort of sit and watch like a gay sex scene just to prove a point. But he could just happily talk about his husband. Could just happily have a picture on in their locker of their boyfriend or their girlfriend or something. And I think that's kind of that level of just normalizing things. I think that's just the next big step.
Yeah, you don't necessarily have to sexualize LGBTQ plus
Correct.
relationships to have them in the game.
Yes, that's the thing. And I think that's, and people, I was chatting to someone the other day and they were sort of like, when how the most difficult relationship to portray in a video game is bisexual, because if you have a sort of, if a man is dating a woman, but the man claims they're bi, how do you show that as part of the mechanic? How can you authentically do that? And it's like, we'll just have a line in there talking about his ex and the ex is a man.
Yeah, it's really not that hard.
It's such an easy thing to rely on, is the fact that like you've to sort of like to comfort the mainstream, to comfort the straights, we're going to have a man and a woman, but to sort of pacify the diversity angle, we're going to claim that the man is bi, but we're not going to do anything about it. And
Yeah.
it's just like, well, at least put like a picture in his locker of a guy that he fancies while he's dating his female or something. Do you know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah,
not.
because it's
Yeah,
almost like
it's not that hard.
invisible representation, isn't it?
Yeah, and by representation is tricky, but it's not that tricky.
Okay, well, I'm conscious of time, and we've been talking for a while, but it's been so interesting. But before we finish, could we just circle back a little bit? I think to an earlier conversation, and could I ask you, Robin, what would be your best piece of advice to someone who is struggling with their identity as part of LGBTQ? And is looking to get into the games industry. Have you got any advice that you would give to somebody?
I think it's a case of like there are support groups out there. Obviously, Gaming Magazine, we're not a support group. We're an educational and consumer driven kind of media outlet that we share positive stories of sort of like queer success and whatever else. I mean, take heart from that people have, you are following in very well trodden footsteps of queer people working in the games industry. So do take heart from that, but go and find support. As you mentioned earlier, Rosie, I think that there's a wonderful organisation called Outmaking Games. I say it's wonderful because I helped co-found it.
It is still wonderful. We
It's
love
still wonderful even without me. But
it.
the whole point of that is to connect queer games workers in the UK, and also we include students in that. So we have a few people that are job hunting. We have a few people that are students at the moment. Get into that group, outmaking.games on the internet. Also then, so that's one aspect of it. I think also then there's the UK games industry Slack has an LGBTQ Slack channel. So if you can get onto that, get onto that. The weird thing is that LGBT people in the industry are looking out for each other. It's just maybe not
Yeah,
the industry looking out for their workers quite yet, as we've been talking about.
yeah,
I think it really is a case of how we then uh, mash those two things together. So there's a lot of support out there for LGBT people. Get that support. If you're struggling with your identity, I think that's almost a separate conversation. Like there are plenty of wonderful charities out there to go and talk to. There are plenty of people you can go and talk to about that. But specifically in the industry, there are 1 in 5 LGBT
yeah.
people that are here waiting for you with open arms. And what the industry isn't doing at the moment, the people in the industry are doing for ourselves through these kind of wonderful groups and through these kind of informal Slack channels and stuff.
Thank you.
Amazing. I think that wraps up really nicely this conversation, and obviously there's a lot more that we could talk about, but I think it's a really nice introduction to, or an insight into the industry and what support is out there and what sort of things you can do. So I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, Robin. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's super nice to have you. And obviously, Robin is a patron of Safe in Our World. But where can people find you, Robin?
So on Twitter, I am at that Robin Gray, Robingray. I believe LinkedIn's kind of the same. But also go and check out Gaming Magazine, GAYMING mag.com, and at Gaming Mag on all socials as well.
Perfect. And if any listeners, if you'd like to continue the conversation, please feel free to tweet us at SIOW podcast or at Safe in Our World. There's a lot more discussion to be had around these topics, and we're absolutely encouraging you to get involved and talk about it as well. If you are struggling, though, please know that there is support out there. We've mentioned a lot of different helplines and support groups already, but if you're looking for somewhere to start, you can visit our website at safeinourworld.org, and there's a list of LGBTQ plus helplines that are global, as well as a lot of different information about feelings and symptoms. So if you're looking for somewhere to start, please head over there. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.